Welcome back to the deep dive. You know the drill. We take the most dense, complex analysis and we try to distill it down to the essential, surprising truths you need to be fluent in. Our focus today is pretty sharp and sobering. We're looking at the rapidly dissolving security architecture that's underpinned Europe for, the last 3 decades. Specifically, we're diving deep into how this whole shift is being seen on the eastern flank. We're focusing on Poland, which finds itself right at a strategic crossroads. And our entire mission today is built on the rigorous and frankly uncompromising analysis from a specific Polish think tank, Strategy and Future, or SNF. They basically argue that the post-Cold War order is gone, leaving Europe strategically exposed.
That's a critical thesis they have. SNF, they don't just see this as, a bad stretch of global politics. They actually diagnose it as a systemic failure by Polish and European elites. For decades, these leaders operated under what SNF calls a mirage of ever-listing Pax Americana. This idea that American peace and protection would just, continue forever.
A mirage.
Yeah. And according to their analysis, that belief led to what they call a cardinal error. They outsourced the fundamental responsibility for their own security. And now that the U.S. is pulling back, that error is really coming due.
Okay, let's unpack that cardinal error. If relying on the U.S. was the mistake, SNF must be tracking the signals that the U.S. relationship has been changing for a long time. I mean, this is moving far beyond just current political rhetoric, right? Where does the timeline of this abandonment start, according to them?
It starts much, much earlier than most people realize. SNF points all the way back to 2009. That was the year of the famous reset with Russia. The think tank argues that if European elites had been clear-eyed, they should have drawn serious conclusions about U.S. priorities right then. The message was already there. The U.S. was not going to pay any price to maintain global primacy indefinitely. European security was already being downgraded.
But the conventional wisdom for years was that any transatlantic disruption was an anomaly, that the Biden administration was, the great restorer. Yet SNF argues that even this administration, the supposed defender of the old order, has actually delivered the most concrete signals of the shift. And they do it through economic policy.
And this is where it gets really interesting. SNF sees the economic break as, more damning than the diplomatic one. They focus on the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which was passed by the current administration. And they characterize this massive domestic subsidy program as an act of hostility toward Europe.
Act of hostility? That's incredibly strong language. For our listeners, what evidence does the think tank use to justify that? I mean, how does a U.S. domestic spending bill translate into hostility?
It's simple economics and geopolitics, really. The IRA offers these massive, targeted subsidies for green energy, electric vehicles, and manufacturing. But only if the final assembly or production happens in the United States.
Ah, there's the catch.
Exactly. SNF argues this policy has successfully drained capital and manufacturing capacity out of Europe and straight into the U.S. It's a policy designed to rebuild American industrial capacity at the expense of its allies.
Right.
And this part is key. The U.S., as the post-World War II hegemon, built the global free trade system. The entire architecture depended on the U.S. keeping its markets open. So when the hegemon starts using protectionist subsidies and restrictions like the IRA to redirect capital away from its allies, the very foundation of that system starts to collapse.
So it's a self-inflicted wound to the old order.
It is. And Europe is paying the immediate price.
So the economic signals were loud.
No.
How did the formal diplomatic roadmap, the National Security Strategy, or NSS, confirm this shift in priorities?
The NSS is brutally pragmatic. It's really the official confirmation of Europe's demotion. It explicitly states that the U.S. must prioritize and that it cannot maintain global primacy everywhere at the same time.
Okay, so what gets top priority then?
Securing the Western Hemisphere. The NSS emphasizes protecting the region from foreign influence, and SNF refers to this focus as the Trump Amendment to the Monroe Doctrine.
The Trump Amendment. Okay, for anyone who might have forgotten their high school history, give us a quick refresher. What was the original Monroe Doctrine from 1823 and why call this an amendment?
Of course. The original doctrine basically warned European powers to stay out of the affairs of the Americas. The modern Trump Amendment that SNF cites demands the hemisphere be free of any foreign power influence. And they're specifically talking about strategic competition with China.
I see.
They even reference a really serious strategic example: Chinese control over ports around the Panama Canal. The priority is crystal clear. The U.S. military has to be geared to handle threats to its immediate south and west, not necessarily to permanently guarantee the defense of Europe's eastern flank.
That reframes everything. And critically, SNF highlights a terrifying detail in the NSS about the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes. They note that the NSS views Russia not as a direct existential enemy of the U.S., but as an impartial arbiter in the conflict.
And an impartial arbiter.
An impartial arbiter between European NATO states and Russia. Just think about the implications of that phrasing.
So if the U.S. sees Russia as impartial, it completely changes the calculation for Poland and the Baltic states.
It suggests the U.S. might not view the conflict as fundamentally its own problem, but a European one.
That is just a continuous stream of alarming signals, and they've been mounting since 2009. So if the signals were that strong economic hostility, strategic demotion, viewing Russia as impartial, why is the European response so muted?
Let's transition to SNF's analysis of the European leaders who seem to be stuck in denial.
The think tank sees outright denial as the primary reaction. They use Donald Tusk's social media post as a specific, almost grotesque example of this disconnect. He posted that Europe is your closest ally, not a problem. We have common enemies, at least it has been so for the last 80 years.
And what made SNF call that post grotesque? Because the post references a shared enemy dynamic, the Soviet threat, that hasn't been relevant for 80 years or at least 30 years since the USSR collapsed.
It's nostalgia.
It's ideological nostalgia, not strategic realism. It just fails to acknowledge that the U.S. has redefined what ally means and that U.S. strategic interests now conflict with Europe's economic interests.
So SNF observes that the political elites are stuck, psychologically, refusing to accept the gravity of the shift.
Exactly. They see the political class cycling through the initial phases of the Kubler-Ross model, shock, anger, denial, rather than moving to acceptance and action. And this psychological denial explains the stunning lack of concrete military preparedness we see across the continent.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of that. What evidence does the Polish think tank provide for this pathetic, weak, small, and very slow response from key European powers? Let's start with the doctrine itself.
The primary indicator of denial, according to SNF, is that the fundamental NATO-Russia Founding Act is still in force.
The one that limits NATO's presence on the eastern flank.
The very same. It prohibits permanent deployment of U.S. combat bases or nuclear sharing. Russia aggressively invaded a sovereign neighbor, yet NATO still clings to this foundational agreement that basically appeases Moscow by limiting its own capacity right at the border.
So they've refused to fundamentally alter their relationship with Moscow.
Signaling inertia over readiness.
That's a massive institutional failure. Now, what about actual boots on the ground and capacity from the major European powers?
The capacity figures are, well, they're alarming. Let's start with Germany.
Okay.
Their stated plan is to enlarge the Bundeswehr by a paltry 1,750 people next year.
Wait, 1,750?
That can't be right.
That's the number. And SNF estimates Germany's current functional capacity is barely one combat division.
Barely one division.
Yeah.
For the largest economy in Europe facing the most complex security challenge since the Cold War, that is almost unbelievable. The analysis gets darker. SNF suggests that because German industrial survival may require prioritizing cheap Russian energy and trade with China, there's a real risk. Berlin may seek a modus vivendi with Russia.
A separate piece.
Potentially. They fear it could lead to a settlement that pacifies Central Europe by effectively sidelining it. It's a recognition that German economic survival might, in the end, trump pan-European security.
That's a terrifying forecast. Economic necessity leading to a partial betrayal of the eastern flank? What about France and the UK?
The numbers don't really improve. France's military chief estimates they can deploy only one division on the eastern flank.
Just one?
And President Macron's much-touted plans for reserve training, they're minimal. We're talking 2,000 to 3,000 volunteers annually. It's tokenism.
And the UK?
As for the United Kingdom, their own defense committee published a report that likened the pace of their defense preparation to a glacier.
A glacier. That is truly the last word you want associated with military response time when you're facing a rapidly mobilizing threat.
And the broader picture just emphasizes the point. European financial support for Ukraine is minimal and shockingly unbalanced. Get this. Scandinavia, with a population of only 30 million people, provides nearly 30% of Europe's total aid to Ukraine.
So the big players are holding back.
They are. SNF concludes that without the U.S. stabilizing presence, the United Europe structure will crack under the pressure. It would inevitably lead to a return of historical inter-European rivalries over influence and resources.
So for Poland, the current strategy, outsourcing their security and hoping for the best, is just a dangerous denial of reality. SNF uses a particularly grim analogy to describe Poland's state, suggesting the nation is suffering from strategic drift.
They describe Poland as a pigeon, walking in circles in the middle of the road until it meets its end.
Wow.
That's the visceral image SNF uses to convey that Poland is moving, but without purpose, without a strategy. They argue the current reliance on the U.S. insurance policy is completely doomed.
So if the current strategy has failed, SNF proposes three radical alternatives that must be consciously considered. Walk us through these high-stakes strategic paths.
The first option is the most ambitious and historically resonant. They call it the imperial or maximalist plan, seeking the gates of Smolensk.
The gates of Smolensk. What does that mean in practical terms?
It's a plan to gain effective control over the area up to the historical Smolensk gate. This would require a complex political and military offer to Kiev, the Baltics, and maybe a future Belarus, to recreate a large, powerful, Central European political entity, something capable of balancing Russia on its own.
That is a staggering ambition, invoking centuries of history. But SNS also places a significant caveat on that, don't they?
They do, and they're very clear about it. The think tank considers this option both dangerous and, very likely, beyond Poland's current economic means.
So it's an ambition, but not necessarily a feasible path.
Right, not without some radical external change.
Okay, so pushing for a new empire is likely off the table for practical reasons. What are the two more pragmatic but still radical options SNF suggests?
The second is a regional alliance, building a strong, explicit anti-Moscow bloc with regional partners who share the threat perception.
So Finland, the Baltics.
Finland, the Baltics, perhaps even Turkey. The key here is that Poland would be one voice in the choir, not the sole leader. It prioritizes capability and collective defense outside the current struggling NATO framework.
And the third option?
The third is arguably the most difficult, emotionally. It's accommodation or survival. This involves consciously deciding to accommodate Russia's demands by assessing what Russia truly wants, and then building just enough strength to negotiate the best possible position for national survival. It's a strategy rooted in cold realism, not any hope for friendship.
These options all require agency and a capacity to act, which SNF argues Poland currently lacks. Instead of waiting for a tragedy, what necessary, hard transactional actions does SNF suggest Poland must take now to increase its leverage? They note that taking the moral high road, like the spy exchange, has yielded no tangible benefits.
They argue for shifting entirely from moral rhetoric to transactional capability. First, Poland must demand the U.S. loosen restrictions on crucial military hardware. For example, demanding control over the technology for long-range strike capabilities or the F-35 fighter jets.
Why is gaining control over that technology so critical?
Because, as SNF notes, without that control, the U.S. retains the ability to unilaterally block Polish defense in a crisis by just flipping a switch on the integrated U.S. systems.
So it's about true independence.
Acquiring genuine control turns Poland from a dependent into a capable, independent ally. Secondly, SNF suggests Poland should express a veiled interest in nuclear capability, maybe starting by gaining decisive control over the civilian nuclear fuel cycle. This increases deterrence and adds weight to negotiations with both the U.S. and Russia.
And finally, SNF proposes an even more immediate and provocative action to show Russia and the West that Poland is a player capable of disrupting the status quo.
Yes. To demonstrate they are ready to break the negotiation table, Poland has to show an ability to generate chaos and impose substantial costs on Russia. The think tank points to the strategic value of the Kaliningrad, or Königsberg, exclave as a potential leverage tool.
How so?
It's something that could be used to impose significant costs on Moscow if Poland is ignored or betrayed by its allies. It's a tool for calculated instability designed to ensure Poland cannot be overlooked.
That is a staggering list of necessary steps, all built on this foundation of clear-eyed realism. So let's bring it all home. The core takeaway from strategy and future is that the era of assured safety guarantees is over. And Europe, especially Poland, must shift its focus immediately from ideological rhetoric to real, measurable military capability.
The contrast they draw is excellent. You just have to look at Finland, another state highly vulnerable to Russia. Finland's strategy, which SNF praises, emphasizes real capability. They maintain the ability to mobilize 280,000 troops quickly, they cultivate high societal morale, And perhaps most importantly, they provide tangible value to the U.S.
What kind of value?
Finland, for example, is co-producing icebreakers. The U.S. needs those for Arctic trade and influence. This makes them a strategic necessity, not just a dependent. Their security is rooted in realism, which is precisely what SNF says Poland is lacking.
SNF's entire analysis suggests that the security status, the borders, and the economic roles of all states are now being actively renegotiated on the international stage. And if Poland continues to avoid making these difficult, risky decisions and clings to this belief in an everlasting U.S. friendship, they risk losing their own agency. So, what specific national asset territory, military dependency, or economic role will the nation ultimately become for others to trade? This is the core question SNF leaves us with, and it's something for you, our listener, to mull over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Central European security. We'll see you next time.